Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey into the echoes of the past. Tonight we ponder a chilling thought. Could you endure even a single day within the walls of a medieval asylum? If this curious exploration into history's darker corners intrigues you before slumber claims you, perhaps consider a gentle tap on the like button, or even subscribe. We'd love to know, where in the world are you joining us from, and what hour does the clock show in your land? Now, let us delve into this shadowy chapter. To truly understand the daunting prospect of a medieval asylum, we must first immerse ourselves in the medieval mindset itself. The world, as they perceived it, was a place deeply intertwined with the spiritual, the mystical, and a framework of understanding the body and mind vastly different from our own. Forget for a moment the sterile gleam of modern medicine, the nuanced language of psychology. We must step into a time where the lines between the physical and metaphysical were far more porous, far more influential in daily life, and crucially in the understanding of suffering. The medieval individual lived under an omnipresent heaven and often an equally palpable hell. Religion wasn't merely a Sunday ritual. It was the bedrock of society, the lens through which all of life's events, including illness, were interpreted. The will of God, or indeed the meddling of darker demonic forces, was a primary consideration when sickness, whether of the body or the mind, befell an individual. Explanations often began and ended with the divine, shaping every response, every attempt at solace or cure. Superstition, too, wove itself into the very fabric of medieval existence. Omens, charms, curses, and protective talismans were not fringe beliefs but mainstream notions. A sudden ailment, a shift in personality, or a prolonged melancholy could easily be attributed to a cursed object, an ill-wished spell, or the malevolent gaze of an envious neighbor. This environment of magical thinking profoundly influenced how unusual behaviors, what we might now recognize as symptoms of mental illness, were perceived and addressed, often with fear and suspicion. Central to their medical understanding, inherited and adapted from ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, was the theory of the four humors. This concept proposed that the human body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or choler, and black bile, or melancholy. Each humor was associated with a specific quality: hot, cold, moist, dry, and an element: air, water, fire, earth, and even a temperament. A healthy individual was one in whom these humors were perfectly balanced. This humoral theory, while a more naturalistic approach than purely supernatural explanations, was still a far cry from understanding the complex biochemistry of the body or the intricate workings of the brain. Illness in this model was often seen as a result of an excess or deficiency in one or more of these humors. An overabundance of black bile, for instance, was thought to lead to melancholy, a term that has survived, albeit with altered meaning, to this day. Treatment, therefore, often focused on rectifying this perceived imbalance through methods like bloodletting, purging, or specific diets. When it came to ailments of the mind, the explanations often took an even more distinctly spiritual turn. The medieval world was one where the battle between good and evil, angels and demons, was considered an ongoing reality. Thus, behavior that was erratic, violent, or profoundly withdrawn could readily be interpreted as evidence of demonic possession. The individual was not merely sick, they were potentially a vessel for malevolent spiritual entities. Alternatively, profound mental distress might be viewed as a form of divine punishment. A sin committed, a vow broken, or a transgression against the church could, it was believed, incur God's wrath, manifesting as madness or severe emotional suffering. This placed an enormous burden of guilt and shame upon the afflicted and their families, further complicating their suffering with spiritual anxieties and social stigma. There was little room for a purely psychological or neurological understanding. The concept of a broken mind as a separate entity from a sick soul or an imbalanced body was largely absent. While physicians might speak of humoral imbalances affecting the brain and thus behavior, the overarching framework often looped back to moral or spiritual causes. The brain was certainly recognized as an organ, but its functions related to thought, emotion, and sanity were filtered through these prevailing religious and humoral beliefs. This lack of sophisticated psychological understanding meant that empathy, as we know it, was structured differently. Fear often overshadowed compassion when faced with behaviors that were inexplicable within their framework. If a person was possessed, the primary concern was casting out the demon, not necessarily alleviating the individual's internal turmoil through gentle understanding or therapeutic intervention. If they were divinely punished, then penance and prayer were the prescribed routes. Consider the sheer weight of these beliefs. Imagine experiencing profound depression or anxiety and being told it was due to an excess of cold, dry, black bile, or worse, that a demon had taken root in your soul, or that God himself was chastising you for some unknown sin. This was the intellectual and spiritual landscape. There was no concept of serotonin imbalance, no understanding of trauma's psychological impact, no diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The very definition of madness was broad and often inconsistently applied. It could encompass everything from what we might now identify as severe learning disabilities, epilepsy, dementia, to acute psychotic episodes or even just eccentric behavior that challenged social norms. The label of mad was a heavy one, carrying with it profound social consequences and often leading to ostracization. Physicians of the era, often clergymen or those trained within monastic traditions, did their best with the knowledge they had. They consulted ancient texts, observed symptoms, and prescribed treatments based on humoral theory. These might include herbal remedies intended to counteract the offending humor, warming herbs for an excess of phlegm, cold and moist, or cooling remedies for too much hot and dry. Bloodletting, a common practice for a vast array of ailments, was also employed for mental disturbances, based on the idea of releasing excess humors or calming agitated blood. Similarly, purges and emetics were used to expel supposed imbalances. The physical experience of these treatments was often harsh and debilitating, adding to the suffering of individuals already in distress. The power of suggestion and the placebo effect within a society deeply invested in faith and ritual cannot be entirely discounted. For some, the religious rituals, the herbal concoctions, or even the dramatic intervention of a physician might have brought some measure of comfort or temporary remission, interpreted as a cure through the lens of their beliefs. However, for many others, these approaches offered little to no relief, and in some cases likely exacerbated their conditions. The focus was rarely on the individual's subjective experience of their distress, in a way a modern therapist would approach it. Instead, the focus was on correcting the perceived imbalance, or expelling the perceived malevolent influence according to the dominant theories of the time. This era lacked the tools for systematic inquiry into mental illness. There were no clinical trials, no peer-reviewed studies in the modern sense, and the dissemination of medical knowledge was slow and often inconsistent. Tradition and the authority of ancient texts, particularly those sanctioned or interpreted by the Church, held sway over empirical observation in many instances. The social fabric also played a crucial role. In tightly knit rural communities, individuals with mental afflictions might be cared for by their families, tolerated, or sometimes feared and isolated within the community itself. The response could vary greatly depending on the nature and severity of the perceived illness, the individual's social standing, and local custom. It was often when an individual's behavior became disruptive to the social order or was deemed dangerous to themselves or others that more formal interventions such as confinement would be considered. But the very idea of an asylum as a place specifically for the mentally ill was still in its nascent stages and vastly different from later conceptions. The medieval understanding of the body as a microcosm of the universe also played a part. Just as the cosmos was ordered by God, so too should the body be. Illness, therefore, was a disruption of this divine order, a form of internal chaos. Restoring health meant restoring this order, often through practices that aimed to purge the body of the agents of this chaos. Think of the sensory world of the medieval person. The smells of wood smoke, incense, and unwashed bodies, the sounds of church bells, farm animals, and perhaps the cries of the afflicted. Their understanding of illness was shaped by this tangible, often harsh, reality, interpreted through the dominant spiritual and humoral frameworks. The unseen world of germs or complex neurochemistry was beyond their imagining. The distinction between physical illness and mental illness was not as sharply defined as it is for us. A fever could cause delirium, and this delirium could be interpreted through the same lenses of humoral imbalance or spiritual influence as a more persistent state of madness. The interconnectedness of body, mind, and spirit was assumed. Religious explanations provided a sense of order, however grim, attributing suffering to God's will or demonic influence, while terrifying, offered a framework for understanding and responding, usually through religious supplication, exorcism, or penance. It placed the inexplicable within a known, albeit supernatural context. The scholars of the time, often monks, meticulously copied and studied ancient medical texts, but innovation was slow. The weight of established authority, particularly figures like Galen, whose theories were harmonized with Christian doctrine, made it difficult for radically new ideas about the causes and nature of illness to emerge and take hold. Thus, when an individual in the medieval period began to exhibit signs of severe mental distress, The community and any attending healers or priests would draw upon this complex tapestry of beliefs, a bit of humoral theory, a large measure of religious interpretation, and a dose of local superstition. This was the intellectual toolkit available. This mindset is crucial to grasp, for it directly informed who was deemed mad, why they were considered so, and what, if anything, was to be done for them. It was a world that sought explanations for suffering, but those explanations were rooted in a reality profoundly different from our own, leading to responses that, from our modern vantage point, often appear misguided, cruel, or at best deeply inadequate. Before we even step into the notional medieval asylum, understanding this intellectual and spiritual climate is paramount. The very reasons for such an institution's existence and the horrors it might contain are born from these foundational beliefs about what it meant to be unwell in mind and body. Having steeped ourselves in the medieval mindset, understanding their interpretations of illness and distress, the question naturally arises, what happened to those individuals deemed mad, lunatic, or profoundly melancholic? Before the formal, if grim institutions we later recognize as asylums became more widespread, the options for care, or more often mere confinement, were varied, often informal and almost universally devoid of what we would now consider therapeutic intent. The concept of a dedicated facility for mental healing was largely alien to the early medieval world, and society's responses were a patchwork of fear, pragmatism, and occasional, flickering compassion. For many, the first and often only line of support, or an individual's primary place of confinement, was their own family. In a society structured around kinship and household units, the responsibility for an afflicted member often fell squarely on their relatives. Compassion undoubtedly existed. Families might patiently care for a loved one experiencing mental turmoil, especially if the condition was mild, intermittent, or if the person could still contribute in some way to the household. They might seek out local healers, priests, or wise women for remedies or prayers, hoping for a return to normalcy within the familiar confines of home. The social standing of the family could also influence this. A family with reputation and means had more capacity to manage such a situation discreetly. However, family care was far from a guaranteed sanctuary. Resources played a significant role. A poor family struggling for subsistence would find an unproductive or disruptive member an immense burden. Understanding, as we've discussed, was limited. Fear and shame could easily eclipse compassion, particularly if the behaviors were seen as bringing scandal upon the household. If an individual's behavior became too challenging, violent, or socially stigmatizing, families might resort to restraining them within the home, perhaps in a locked room, an outbuilding, or even through physical bindings, not necessarily out of malice, but from a desperate attempt to manage a situation they could neither comprehend nor control, and to protect the family's fragile standing. In some instances, abandonment was the tragic outcome, especially for those without strong family ties or from impoverished backgrounds. If a family could no longer cope, or if an individual had no family to speak of, they might be left to wander, becoming part of a marginalized population of beggars and vagrants. The medieval landscape was dotted with such figures, their fates uncertain, reliant on the sporadic charity of strangers or the harsh realities of survival on the fringes of society. Their madness became just one more layer to their vulnerability, making them easy targets for abuse or neglect. The open road offered no true freedom, only a different form of peril. Monasteries and other religious houses sometimes played a role, albeit a complex and not always primary one. These centers of learning and piety were occasionally places of refuge for various societal outcasts, including those suffering from mental afflictions. Some monastic orders emphasized compassion and care for the sick as part of their Christian duty. Individuals might be taken in, offered food and shelter, and prayers would be offered for their spiritual and mental well-being. The serene and structured environment of a monastery, with its predictable rhythms of prayer and work, might, for some, have inadvertently provided a calming influence, a temporary respite from a chaotic internal or external world. Yet, it's crucial to understand that monasteries were not medieval psychiatric hospitals. Their primary purpose was religious devotion and work, not the specialized care of the mentally ill. If they did accept such individuals, it was often on a case-by-case basis, and the treatment would be predominantly spiritual, prayers, blessings, perhaps attempts at exorcism if demonic influence was suspected. Physical restraints might also be used within monastic settings if an individual was deemed a danger to themselves or the orderly life of the community. If an individual was too disruptive or seen as a spiritual threat, they would likely be turned away or expelled. Some records even suggest that monasteries at times were places where families could pay to have troublesome relatives housed, effectively a form of custodial care with a spiritual veneer, easing the family's burden but offering little hope of recovery. For those whose madness was perceived as dangerous, or for those who had no other recourse, the options became significantly grimmer. Local jails or town dungeons, primarily intended for criminals, often became receptacles for the severely mentally distressed. Here, they would be incarcerated alongside felons, debtors, and other lawbreakers, with no distinction made for their condition nor any attempt to alleviate their specific suffering. The conditions in such places were typically appalling, dark, filthy, overcrowded, and with little provision for even basic human needs, let alone any form of care. The sounds, the smells, the constant threat of violence from other inmates would have been a torment. The rationale for such confinement was purely about public safety or social order. If someone was raving in the streets, causing disturbances, or perceived as a threat, locking them away was the simplest solution for the authorities. There was no concept of their rights as a patient. They were simply a problem to be contained. The notion of a therapeutic environment was centuries away. These individuals were often chained, sometimes to walls or floors, forgotten and left to languish in conditions that would undoubtedly worsen any existing psychological distress, pushing them further into the depths of their affliction. The chill of the stone, the dampness, the darkness, these became their world. The early precursors to hospitals, known as infirmaries or lazar houses, primarily for leprosy, sometimes had sections or annexes where the sick poor, including those with mental disturbances, might be housed. Institutions like the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, later infamous as Bedlam, began in 1247 not as a general hospital for the needy, supported by alms. Only much later, transitioning over centuries, did it gain its notorious reputation, specifically for the insane. In these early general institutions, the mentally ill were often just one group among many, receiving little specialized attention, and frequently subjected to the same physical treatments as those with bodily diseases. Care in these rudimentary hospital settings was minimal, focusing on basic sustenance, if available, and shelter. Medical treatment, based on humoral theories, might be applied indiscriminately by physicians who, though perhaps learned in Galen, had no specific remedies for ailments of the mind beyond these general principles. Patients might be bled, purged, or given herbal concoctions, but there was no understanding of specific mental pathologies or targeted treatments. The staff were not trained psychiatric nurses or doctors. They were often religious volunteers or poorly paid attendants whose primary role was custodial, ensuring the inmates did not escape or cause too much disruption. It is vital to reiterate that the concept of structured therapeutic care involving psychological understanding, talk therapy, or rehabilitation simply did not exist in the medieval period. The primary aims of confinement, where it occurred outside the family, were to protect society, to relieve families of a burden, or simply to remove an inconvenient individual from public view. The well-being or recovery of the person themselves was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. Any kindness shown was an individual act, not a systemic feature. And the reasons for confinement were incredibly broad and often intertwined with social and economic factors, not just clear-cut cases of severe mental illness as we might diagnose them today. Poverty was a significant driver. An individual who was destitute and perhaps behaving erratically due to starvation, exposure, or physical illness might be labeled mad and confined simply because there was no other social safety net. Their primary problem might have been indigence, with their mental state a consequence or a complicating factor. Their pleas for help perhaps misinterpreted as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. Being an inconvenience to one's family or community could also lead to confinement. This might include individuals with intellectual disabilities, those suffering from dementia and old age, or even people who were simply eccentric, rebellious, or failed to conform to social norms. If a family had the means, and the motive, perhaps to control inheritance or remove a source of embarrassment, arranging for someone to be put away was sometimes possible, with madness serving as a convenient label. The legal status of someone deemed non-compos mentis often meant they lost control of their property and person, making them vulnerable to such exploitation. Actual severe mental illness, such as conditions involving psychosis, mania, or deep, debilitating depression, would certainly lead to individuals being identified as mad. The visible and often frightening symptoms of these conditions would fit the medieval understanding of lunacy or possession. For these individuals, confinement in a dungeon or a basic hospital annex offered no solace, only suffering. Their illnesses were not understood, their experiences were invalidated, and their environment, loud, chaotic, and often brutal, was often antithetical to any form of healing or peace. Epilepsy, too, was often misunderstood and conflated with madness or demonic possession due to the dramatic nature of seizures and the temporary alteration of consciousness. Sufferers could find themselves ostracized or confined despite being lucid between episodes. The lack of medical distinction meant that a wide net was cast, catching many different conditions under the umbrella of insanity, with little attempt to differentiate or understand the underlying causes. Furthermore, the lines between criminality and madness were frequently blurred. An individual committing a crime might be excused from execution on grounds of insanity, but this often meant indefinite confinement in harsh conditions rather than punishment followed by release. Conversely, someone exhibiting strange behavior might be accused of witchcraft or heresy, particularly if their utterances were deemed blasphemous, leading to persecution by religious or secular authorities, a fate arguably worse than simple confinement for being merely mad. The duration of such confinement was unpredictable. Some might be held for short periods, perhaps during acute episodes if they were fortunate enough to have someone advocate for their release, and then return to their families or to fend for themselves. Others might spend years or even their entire lives locked away, effectively disappearing from society, their names perhaps recorded in a ledger, but their humanity largely forgotten. There were no review boards, no appeals processes for those deemed mad. Their fate was largely in the hands of their keepers or the community that had confined them. Consider the lived experience. Removed from familiar surroundings, often forcibly restrained with ropes or chains, surrounded by strangers who might be indifferent or cruel, possibly in squalor, with no understanding of why they were there or what was happening to them. Any existing anxiety, fear, or paranoia would likely be intensely magnified. The very act of such confinement, with its sensory deprivation or, conversely, sensory overload of horror, could be profoundly damaging to an individual's mental state, irrespective of their initial condition. This was a world without patient advocacy, without a voice for the voiceless. The financial aspect also dictated where someone might end up. Wealthier families might arrange for private care, perhaps hiring someone to look after an afflicted relative in a secluded part of their estate, or paying a monastery or a physician for long-term supervision. This, however, was an option available to very few. For the majority, if family care failed or was non-existent, the alternatives were stark and public, or simply involved being cast out. Parish charities or alms might offer occasional, meager support to the deserving mad poor, but this was inconsistent and insufficient for long-term care. The lack of centralized authority or a systematic approach to mental affliction meant that responses varied greatly from region to region and even from town to town. Local customs, the attitude of the local lord or bishop, and the availability of any form of rudimentary institution all played a part. In some rural communities, an eccentric or simple individual might be tolerated, even protected, becoming a familiar, if marginalized, part of the village landscape. In larger, more anonymous urban centers, such tolerance might be less forthcoming, with public order being a greater concern, leading more readily to calls for removal and confinement. The community itself, beyond the immediate family, played a complex role. Neighbors might offer support, or they might react with fear and demand that a disruptive individual be dealt with. Popular beliefs about madness, often fueled by superstition, could lead to collective ostracism or even violence. Yet there were also instances of communal efforts to provide for those who could not care for themselves, sometimes through church collections or the benevolence of local guilds, though this was more often directed at the worthy poor rather than the unruly mad. For those deemed wandering mad, life was exceptionally precarious. They faced starvation, exposure to the elements, and the constant threat of violence or exploitation. Some might have been viewed with a degree of superstitious awe, perhaps as holy fools touched by God, and thereby receive occasional charity. More often, however, their bizarre behavior would elicit fear or mockery. The image of the ship of fools, whether a literal practice of deporting the unwanted or a powerful allegory, captures the societal desire to expel those who did not fit, to send them away from the community's sight and mind. These early forms of confinement, driven by fear, necessity, or crude attempts at order, laid a grim foundation. They reflected society's struggle to cope with behaviors and conditions it could not explain within its prevailing worldview. The idea of a purpose-built institution specifically for the mad was only slowly beginning to germinate in some isolated areas towards the later medieval period, often growing out of existing charitable foundations or urban efforts to control vagrancy and public disorder. Thus, before the rise of more formal, dedicated asylums, the mad occupied a precarious and poorly defined space in society. They might be visible in the community, cared for, tolerated, or feared, or they might be hidden away, in back rooms, in monastic cells, in jail cells, or in the crowded wards of general infirmaries. The common thread was a profound lack of understanding and an absence of care aimed at genuine recovery or even basic human dignity. This was the reality that predated and in many ways precipitated the eventual, though deeply flawed, development of the asylum system. The journey towards more specialized institutions was a slow and often brutal one, built upon centuries of ad hoc responses. As the medieval period progressed, the ad hoc methods of dealing with individuals considered mad, family care, monastic charity, or grim confinement in dungeons, slowly began to see the nascent emergence of institutions that over time would become more specifically associated with housing the mentally distressed. These were not asylums born of enlightened medical understanding, but rather spaces that evolved, often from quite different origins, to accommodate a segment of the population that society struggled to manage. Among these, one name would eventually echo through history with a chilling resonance: Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, more famously or infamously known as Bedlam. The story of Bedlam begins not as a lunatic asylum, but as the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, founded in 1247 by Godfrey, Bishop of Bethlehem. It was established in the parish of St. Botolph, without Bishopsgate in London. Its primary purpose was religious, to serve as a monastic house for the canons of the Order of St. Mary of Bethlehem, and, crucially, to raise funds and support for the Crusader Church of St. Mary in Bethlehem in the Holy Land. It was also intended to offer hospitality to visiting dignitaries from its mother church. For much of its early existence, Bethlem functioned as a small, relatively unremarkable priory and general hospital, providing alms and shelter to the poor and sick, as many religious houses of the era did. There is no indication in its founding charters or earliest records that it was specifically intended for the care or confinement of those deemed insane. The transition towards this particular role was gradual, almost accidental, and reflects society's increasing need to find places for individuals whose behavior was profoundly disruptive or beyond the capacity of their families or local communities to handle. The first unambiguous mention of Bethlem housing those with mental disorders appears somewhat later, in the early 14th century. By 1330, it was referred to as a hospital, and records from 1377 note that among its inmates were lunatic or distracted individuals. By 1403, an inventory mentions items specific to the confinement of such persons: 6 chains of iron, with 6 locks, 4 pairs of manacles of iron, and 2 pairs of stock. This grim accounting signals a definite, if perhaps still evolving, function of the institution. It was becoming a place where the mad were not just present, but actively managed through restraint. It's important to understand that, even as Bethlem began this transformation, the care offered was custodial at best. The sophisticated medical and psychological treatments we associate with mental health care today were unimaginable. Any medical intervention would have been rooted in the prevailing humoral theory, likely involving bleeding, purging, or dietary regimens, applied with little distinction between physical and mental ailments. The primary objective was not cure or therapy, but containment and the maintenance of a semblance of order within its walls. There was no concept of individualized treatment plans, only generalized, often harsh, bodily interventions. The financial status and governance of Bethlem also shaped its character. Initially a religious priory, it faced periods of poverty and neglect. In 1346, the City of London took over its administration, and later, in 1547, King Henry VIII granted it to the City of London, officially making it a royal hospital. This royal patronage, however, did not necessarily translate into better conditions or a more enlightened approach to its inhabitants, especially in these early centuries. Its resources were often meager, and its management preoccupied with basic survival, meaning the inmates were often at the bottom of the priority list. The very name Bedlam gradually transformed in common parlance through colloquial slurring. Bedlam Hospital became Bedlam. This linguistic shift is significant, as the word Bedlam itself became and remains a synonym for chaos, uproar, madness, and bewildering confusion. And the institution's developing reputation was so potent that its name passed into the English language to describe the very conditions it housed, a stark testament to the perceived state within its walls and the societal terror of unchecked insanity. Imagining the physical environment of early Bedlam requires some historical inference, as detailed architectural plans for its specific use for the mentally ill in the 13th or 14th centuries are scarce. It was likely a stark utilitarian structure. Any cells or rooms used for confining the lunatics would have been basic, offering minimal comfort or hygiene. Security would have been paramount, meaning heavy doors, barred windows, and the aforementioned chains and manacles. Light, warmth, and sanitation, common concerns in most medieval buildings, would likely have been particularly poor for those deemed the most troublesome or least deserving. The pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and stale sickness would have been a constant, oppressive presence. The reputation of such nascent institutions, Bedlam included, quickly became fearsome, and for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, there was the pervasive belief that madness was largely incurable. Once consigned to a place like Bedlam, the expectation was that one would likely remain there, often for life, with little hope of recovery or return to society. This made committal akin to a sentence of social, if not actual, death. The gates of Bedlam in the popular imagination were often seen as a one-way passage into oblivion. Secondly, tales of neglect, whether entirely accurate for its earliest phase or colored by later realities, began to circulate. Insufficient food, lack of proper clothing against the cold, and generally squalid living conditions were assumed to be the norm. The inmates were often reliant on charity or the meager funds of the institution itself, which were seldom adequate. Such neglect would not only cause physical suffering but would undoubtedly exacerbate any existing mental distress, creating a cycle of decline. Hunger, cold, and filth were constant companions for many within its walls. The routine use of physical restraint was another major factor in the fearful reputation of these places. Chains, manacles, and stocks were not seen as last resorts but as standard tools for managing difficult or violent individuals. The idea of being bound, perhaps in darkness or isolation, for extended periods was a terrifying prospect. This was not therapeutic restraint but a means of control, often brutal and applied without medical supervision, reflecting a view of the mad as less than human, akin to wild animals needing to be subdued. The clanking of chains became one of the dreaded soundscapes associated with such places. Furthermore, the profound social stigma associated with madness and its institutions played a crucial role. To be an inmate of Bedlam was to be publicly branded as mad, an outcast from mainstream society. This stigma extended to families, who often felt shame and disgrace. The walls of Bedlam didn't just confine bodies, they enshrined a deep societal judgment, isolating individuals from all previous social connections and supports. This othering process was potent. The institution served as a visible boundary between the sane world and the insane, reinforcing societal norms by physically excluding those who deviated. The general populace's fear of madness itself, often rooted in superstition and a lack of understanding, was projected onto the places that contained it. These institutions were seen as repositories of the terrifying unknown, places where the limits of human reason and behavior were breached. The unpredictability associated with lunacy, the sudden rages, the incoherent speech, the bizarre behaviors, witnessed or rumored, fueled this dread. Stories, likely embellished, of the inmates' actions would filter out, confirming public anxieties about the dangers lurking within. The sounds that might emanate from within, cries, shouts, or unnerving silences, would only have amplified the anxieties and grim speculations of those outside. Even the very spiritual well-being of such a place could be questioned by the populace. In an era where demonic possession was a real fear, an institution concentrating so many afflicted individuals might itself be seen as tainted, a battleground for dark forces, or a place under a divine curse. This added a layer of metaphysical dread to the physical fears, making Bedlam a place to be shunned not just for its human misery but for its potential spiritual contamination. Isolation was a key component of the experience and the fear. Being removed from one's family, community, and familiar surroundings would be distressing for anyone. For someone already grappling with mental turmoil, this forced separation could be devastating, intensifying feelings of abandonment, confusion, and despair. There was little to no contact with the outside world for many inmates, making them feel as if they had been entirely forgotten by everyone they once knew. This profound loneliness was a silent tormentor. The daily reality for those confined, beyond the physical discomforts, was one of crushing monotony. There was no purposeful activity, no occupation to engage the mind or spirit. Days would stretch into an endless expanse of nothingness, punctuated only by meager meals or the occasional intervention of a keeper. This enforced idleness and lack of stimulation could only deepen existing conditions, like melancholy, or lead to further mental deterioration in others. The mind, left to its own disordered devices in such a barren environment, often had nowhere to go but further inward into its distress. While Bethlem is the most famous example from England, it wasn't entirely unique in Europe, though dedicated institutions were still very rare in this early period. Some towns and cities began to allocate specific sections of existing hospitals or poorhouses for the mentally disordered. For instance, Valencia in Spain saw the establishment of the Hospital of Our Lady Mary of the Innocents in 1409, often cited as one of the earliest institutions specifically for the mentally ill. However, the scale and subsequent notoriety of Bedlam give it a particular prominence in this dark history. The rise of these early institutions was an incremental and often grim evolution, not a planned revolution in care. They emerged from a societal need to deal with individuals who could not be managed otherwise, adapting existing structures or charitable foundations for this purpose. There was no overarching theory of psychiatric care guiding their development. Rather, they were practical, if often brutal, responses to a pressing social problem. Their growth was organic, responding to local pressures and available resources, not to a call for humane treatment. The population within these early institutions was often a mixture. While some inmates undoubtedly suffered from what we would now recognize as severe mental illnesses, psychoses, severe mania, or debilitating melancholia, others might have been confined for different reasons. The elderly with dementia, individuals with epilepsy or significant learning difficulties, and even those whose primary affliction was poverty or social nonconformity could find themselves labeled mad and institutionalized, especially if they lacked familial support or became a public nuisance. The lines were incredibly blurred. The very definition of who qualified for such confinement was loose and subjective, often resting with local authorities or the individuals managing the institution. There were no formal diagnostic criteria. If a person's behavior was sufficiently problematic, or if a family was desperate enough, perhaps to gain control over property or to rid themselves of a difficult relative, committal could occur. The legal finality of such a committal, stripping the individual of their rights and autonomy, made these institutions even more feared by those who saw them as potential tools of familial or social control. Even in its initial stages, the public's perception of Bedlam was likely one of dread and morbid curiosity, while the later, more infamous practice of allowing the public to pay to view the inmates for entertainment was yet to come. Any place known to house the mad would have been an object of local discussion, rumor, and fear. The walls themselves would have seemed to contain an unsealable, unsettling world, a microcosm of humanity's darkest afflictions. The transition of Bethlem from a general priory and hospital to a place primarily known for housing the mentally ill was a slow creep, spanning decades, even centuries. Its early reputation was built on the general fears surrounding madness, the visible means of restraint, and the perceived hopelessness of the conditions it housed. It was less about what happened inside in terms of treatment, for there was little of that, and more about what the institution represented, a place of last resort, a symbol of societal exclusion and the terrifying power of an unhinged mind. The very architecture, even if not initially designed for this purpose, would have been adapted. Stronger doors, reinforced windows, perhaps specific cells for the more violent inmates would have become necessary features. These physical modifications themselves would speak to the nature of the confinement, emphasizing security over comfort, control over care. The sounds filtering out would be of human distress, not healing, a cacophony that fueled nightmares. The staff in such an early institution would not have been medically trained in any modern sense. They would have been wardens, keepers, perhaps some religious brothers or sisters in the very beginning, whose primary duty was to feed the inmates, however poorly, and prevent escapes or serious injury. Such positions were unlikely to attract the highly skilled or deeply compassionate. They were often poorly paid, difficult, and dangerous jobs. The keepers' own fears, frustrations, and lack of understanding would inevitably color their treatment of those in their charge, likely leading to indifference or even outright cruelty as a means of managing an overwhelming and poorly understood population. Consider the contrast. A priory intended for prayer and hospitality, slowly morphing into a holding place for society's most troubled and feared individuals. This shift reflects not a medical advancement, but a societal expediency. There was little understanding of the underlying causes of mental illness, and therefore little basis for therapeutic intervention. Confinement, stark and simple, was the primary intervention offered by society. The very air of such a place would have been thick with despair. For the inmates, often confused, frightened, and cut off from everything familiar, the experience must have been profoundly traumatizing. The lack of any structured day, the absence of kindness, the constant presence of suffering in others, all contributed to an atmosphere of hopelessness. For the world outside, Bethlem and similar institutions were becoming shadowy landmarks, spoken of in hushed tones, symbols of the terrifying fragility of the human mind and the harsh realities of medieval attempts to cope with its unraveling. This early phase of institutionalization, exemplified by the slow transformation of Bethlem, set a bleak precedent. It established the idea of sequestering the mentally ill from society, but without the resources, knowledge, or often the will to provide genuine care or hope for recovery. The fear these places instilled was a direct consequence of the conditions within and the societal attitudes they reflected, attitudes that viewed the mad as dangerous, burdensome, or divinely cursed. This was merely the dawn of the asylum, and it was a dark dawn indeed, casting long shadows that would stretch for centuries. Having acknowledged the grim reality of early institutions like Bethlem, we now turn our attention to a deeply personal and terrifying moment, the process of being deemed mad and entering such a place. This was not a journey undertaken willingly, nor was it guided by medical science or compassionate understanding. It was a descent into an often unknown world, dictated by the fears, beliefs, and practicalities of medieval society. The path to the asylum door was fraught with anxiety, confusion, and the stark realization of losing one's place in the world, a process that could itself inflict profound psychological wounds. The decision to commit someone was rarely clear-cut and almost never involved the consent of the individual concerned. More often, it was the culmination of a series of desperate circumstances or societal pressures. The primary arbiters of an individual's sanity and thus their fate were often those closest to them, their own family. A husband, wife, parent, or sibling might initiate the process, driven by a complex mix of emotions. Genuine concern and a desire to protect a loved one from self-harm could be a motive, especially if their behavior had become erratic or dangerous to themselves or others in the household. However, families also faced immense strain. The burden of caring for someone with severe mental disturbances in a medieval household with limited resources and no understanding of the condition could be overwhelming. Exhaustion, fear for other family members, and the relentless disruption to daily life might lead them to seek an external solution, however dreadful. The perceived shame and social stigma associated with having a mad relative could also exert powerful pressure, pushing families to conceal the problem or eventually to remove its source from their midst, hoping to restore a semblance of normalcy to their lives. In some unfortunate cases, baser motives could be at play. If an individual stood in the way of an inheritance, or if a spouse wished to be rid of their partner, a convenient accusation of madness could be a powerful tool. While proving such malicious intent is difficult through the midst of time, the lack of rigorous assessment and the societal readiness to believe in sudden descents into insanity meant that the system was open to abuse. A family's declaration, especially if supported by local opinion or the testimony of compliant acquaintances, often carried enough weight to seal someone's fate within the asylum walls, regardless of their true mental state. Beyond the immediate family, the wider community played a significant role. In the tight-knit villages and towns of medieval Europe, behavior that deviated sharply from the norm was quickly noticed and discussed. If an individual's actions were perceived as a threat to public safety, perhaps through violent outbursts, arson, or acts of destruction, the community would demand action. Neighbors, village elders, or guild members might collectively decide that someone was no longer safe to live among them, petitioning local authorities for their removal and confinement, viewing it as a necessary measure for collective security. The fear of moral or even spiritual contagion also influenced community decisions. Erratic or blasphemous behavior might be interpreted not just as madness, but as a sign of demonic influence or divine displeasure, which could, it was feared, bring misfortune upon the entire community if not contained. Thus, the impetus to confine could be as much about safeguarding the collective soul and maintaining divine favor as it was about public order. The mad individual became a scapegoat for communal anxieties, their removal a ritualistic purging of sorts. Local authorities such as parish officials, beadles, constables, or magistrates were the next layer of decision-makers. Their involvement was typically triggered when an individual became a public nuisance, a vagrant displaying bizarre behavior, someone openly aggressive, or a person whose family formally relinquished care or was unable to provide it. The primary concern of these officials was the maintenance of public order and the removal of unsightly or disruptive elements from the streets. They were not welfare officers seeking the best outcome for the individual, but enforcers of societal norms, tasked with keeping the peace. The clergy, too, held considerable sway. A local priest might be consulted to determine if an individual's condition was due to natural causes, sinfulness, or demonic possession. His opinion could heavily influence whether someone was subjected to religious rituals, such as exorcism, or deemed suitable for confinement in an institution that, like Bethlem, often had religious origins. A priest's pronouncement of incurable madness or dangerous possession could accelerate the journey to the asylum, lending a perceived divine authority to the committal. The evidence upon which these crucial decisions were made bore no resemblance to modern psychiatric diagnoses. There were no clinical interviews, no brain scans, no understanding of neurotransmitters. Instead, madness was judged by observable behaviors that transgressed social and rational boundaries. Violent or self-injurious actions, prolonged periods of incoherent speech or nonsensical babbling, and a deep, unresponsive melancholy that rendered a person unable to function were common indicators that could trigger alarm and intervention. Public displays of bizarre behavior, such as undressing in the street, shouting obscenities, engaging in public indecency, or claiming fantastic visions, if not interpreted as holy, would also mark someone as mad. A persistent refusal to work, eat, or adhere to basic social customs, or an inability to recognize family and friends could contribute to the perception of lost reason. Essentially, any profound and sustained deviation from expected conduct, particularly if it was disruptive or inexplicable within the common understanding of the time, could lead to the dreaded label and its dire consequences. The subjectivity inherent in these criteria meant that eccentricity could easily be misconstrued as madness, especially if an individual was already marginalized due to poverty, old age, or social awkwardness. Those who questioned religious dogma or social hierarchies too vocally also risked being branded as mad as a way to silence or discredit them. The line between a troubled mind and a troublesome disposition was dangerously thin and easily blurred by fear, ignorance, or malice. Once the decision was made, the journey to the institution began. This was rarely a gentle persuasion. If the individual was unwilling, as they often were, understandingly so, force was employed. They might be bound with ropes, perhaps roughly tied to a cart, or manhandled by family members, community volunteers, or local constables. The experience of being physically overpowered and transported against one's will, often without understanding why or where, would have been profoundly terrifying and disorienting, a violent prelude to further traumas. Imagine the emotional state of the person being taken, a maelstrom of fear, confusion, betrayal, and utter helplessness. If they possessed moments of lucidity, the dawning horror of their destination, a place likely whispered about with dread, would be overwhelming. The sense of betrayal, particularly if beloved family members were seen to be complicit in their removal, could inflict deep psychological wounds, shattering trust and compounding their existing distress. This journey was an act of profound social and emotional dislocation. Then came the arrival. The very sight of the building, whether it was the looming fortified walls of Bethlem or a repurposed, grim-looking local infirmary, would have been daunting. Heavy, often barred doors and small, inaccessible windows would immediately signal a place of confinement, not healing. The architecture itself spoke of imprisonment, a stark contrast to the open community or even the familiar, if difficult, confines of home. It was a visual confirmation of their worst fears. As those doors creaked open, the first wave of sensory assault would strike. The sounds would be a cacophony of human suffering. The shouts and screams of agitated inmates, the moans of those in despair or physical pain, the clatter of chains or the thud of bodies against restraints, perhaps the harsh, indifferent voices of the keepers trying to impose order. This wasn't the quietude of a sanctuary, but the uproar of a place barely containing immense distress. For someone already struggling with a fragile mental state, or even for a relatively stable person caught in this nightmare, such an environment could be instantly overwhelming and profoundly disturbing. Next, the smells. Medieval sanitation was rudimentary at best, and in an institution housing numerous individuals, many of whom were incontinent or unable to care for their basic hygiene, the stench would have been overpowering. The foul odor of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, urine, feces, and vomit would mingle with the smell of damp stone, rotting straw, if any was provided for bedding, and perhaps the metallic tang of iron restraints, or the acrid scent of crude, ineffective medicines, or disinfectants. This olfactory onslaught would be a constant reminder of the squalor and degradation within, an inescapable aspect of their new environment. Visually, the interior would offer no comfort. Dimly lit corridors, perhaps by a few flickering torches or lanterns, or simply by the meager light filtering through grimy, barred windows, would reveal scenes of neglect and despair. One might catch glimpses of other inmates, some chained to walls, others huddled in corners, some exhibiting disturbing behaviors, their faces etched with fear, vacancy, or aggression. The keepers themselves, likely rough and unkempt, would offer no welcoming presence, their expressions often mirroring the grimness of the surroundings. The intake process, if it could be dignified with such a term, was perfunctory and geared towards containment, not understanding or care. There was no medical or psychological assessment as we would recognize it. No physician would gently inquire about symptoms. No therapist would explore the patient's history or emotional state. The concept of a tailored treatment plan was centuries away. The primary concern was how to manage this new arrival with the least trouble and the most security. The individual's internal world was of no concern, only their external manifestations mattered. If the individual was accompanied, some basic details might be recorded: a name, perhaps their village of origin, and who had brought them. The payment of a fee by the family or parish might also be noted, as this could sometimes influence, however minimally, the level of attention, more accurately, the harshness of neglect the inmate received. For paupers, the institution received only a pittance, ensuring their conditions were often the worst. Often, however, individuals might arrive alone, found wandering, or be unable or unwilling to communicate coherently. In such cases, they entered as anonymous souls, their past erased, their identity reduced to that of inmate. The moment of handover was a critical and often brutal severance. Family members or authorities would officially relinquish their charge to the keepers of the institution. For the individual, this could feel like the ultimate act of abandonment, the severing of the last tie to the familiar world. The asylum gates closing behind them symbolized the end of one life and the beginning of an uncertain, terrifying new existence. There was no gentle transition, no period of adjustment, only abrupt immersion into a harsh new reality. Upon entry, the new inmate might be searched, not for medical reasons, but for any objects that could be used as weapons or tools for escape. Personal belongings, if any, were often confiscated. Small trinkets, familiar clothes, religious icons, anything that offered a link to their former life or a modicum of comfort. Sometimes they would be stripped of their own garments, which might be lice-ridden or filthy, and given a rough, institutional shift, or perhaps nothing at all, left in their own degrading rags. This act of stripping was profoundly dehumanizing, an immediate assertion of institutional power and the erasure of personal identity. The initial judgment by the warden or keepers was swift and non-medical, based purely on expedience. Based on a cursory observation of the new arrival's behavior, were they violent, noisy, quiet, compliant, or resistant? A decision would be made about their immediate placement and the level of restraint required. There was no nuanced understanding of different mental conditions. Behavior was the sole criterion, and any sign of agitation or resistance was met with an assumption of danger. A person thrashing in terror might be deemed violent and immediately subjected to harsh measures, further escalating their fear. This lack of individualization was a core feature of the admission. Whether one was suffering from deep melancholia, manic excitement, delusions, or simply age confusion, the initial reception was largely the same, a process designed to categorize for control. The keepers, often uneducated and ill-equipped for their roles, relied on crude stereotypes of the madman to guide their actions, viewing inmates more as unruly beasts than as suffering human beings. Their own fears and superstitions undoubtedly played a part, reacting to bizarre pronouncements or unsettling behaviors with apprehension and a quick resort to restraints. Its assignment to a space followed. This could mean being locked into a small, isolated cell, perhaps deep within the building, dark and cold, with only a stone floor for a bed. Or, if the institution had communal wards, they might be thrust into a crowded room with other inmates, a chaotic and potentially dangerous environment where the vulnerable were at the mercy of the more aggressive. Some, considered harmless but simply needing to be off the streets, might even be left in an open yard or outbuilding, exposed to the elements, their care minimal. If deemed necessary by the keepers, which was often the case for anyone exhibiting agitation or perceived strength, restraints would be applied almost immediately. Heavy iron chains, manacles for the wrists and ankles, or wooden stocks that immobilized the limbs were common tools. This wasn't a response to an acute crisis, but a standard preventative measure designed to ensure control and the safety of the staff and other inmates, as they saw. The cold, hard reality of these restraints, chafing skin and restricting all movement, was one of the first and most visceral experiences of asylum life. There was an utter lack of welcome or comfort in this arrival. No kind words were offered, no gentle hands guided them. Explanations, if given at all, would be brief, harsh, or delivered in a manner that was more threatening than reassuring. The atmosphere was one of cold indifference at best, and outright hostility or brutality at worst. The new inmate was immediately confronted with their own powerlessness, a tiny, insignificant cog in a grim, uncaring machine, their pleas or protests likely ignored or met with punishment. The legal framework surrounding committal was rudimentary and heavily biased towards the authorities and the community. While in some jurisdictions a magistrate's order or some form of local council approval might be required, these processes were typically focused on verifying the social disruption caused by the individual, not on their medical needs or rights. There was little to no legal recourse for the person being committed, especially if they were poor, uneducated, or lacked influential connections. Appeals were virtually unheard of, and a committal was, for all intents and purposes, final. The psychological impact of this entire admission process could be devastating. For someone already disoriented or paranoid, the experience would confirm their worst fears. For an individual who was perhaps merely eccentric or temporarily distressed, The trauma of being forcibly institutionalized in such a brutal manner could precipitate a more serious decline. The very act of entry was an assault on dignity, autonomy, and hope. Imagine the first night. After the chaos of arrival and the shock of intake, the new inmate would be left, often alone even, in a crowded space, to confront their new reality. Darkness would amplify the terrifying sounds, the distant screams, the rattling of chains, the weeping. The cold would seep into their bones. Sleep, if it came at all, would be fitful, haunted by the day's events and the dread of an unknown tomorrow. This immediate immersion in misery set the tone for their entire existence within the institution. The sense of hopelessness instilled from the very outset cannot be overstated. The entire admission procedure, from the initial accusation to the final clanging of a cell door, communicated a clear message. You are beyond help, you are a burden, you are here to be forgotten. Any spark of hope for understanding, for kindness, for recovery was likely extinguished upon arrival, replaced by a bleak acceptance of a living death. It is a tragic irony that the word asylum derives from roots meaning a place of safety, a sanctuary, a place inviolable. The medieval institutions that bore this name, or names like Bethlem, were the antithesis of this ideal during their admission process. There was no safety, no sanctuary, only fear, degradation, and the immediate imposition of a brutal regime. Once inside, the initial shock and trauma of arrival would begin to settle, replaced by a dawning, dreadful understanding of their new reality. The fear and confusion might not lessen, but would instead solidify into a state of chronic apprehension or deep despair. They were now inhabitants of a world apart, a place feared by all outside its walls, and their life, as they knew it, was over. This was the brutal truth of entering a medieval asylum, an experience designed to contain, not to cure, to isolate, not to integrate, and to strip away every vestige of the person they once were. The journey had ended, and the grim existence within the institution's confines had irrevocably begun. Having endured the disorienting and often brutal process of admission, the individual thrust into a medieval institution for the mad now faced the grim reality of daily existence. Life inside was not a period of healing or even humane containment as we might conceive it. Instead, it was an immersion into an environment almost perfectly designed to exacerbate suffering, a physical world that mirrored the internal chaos attributed to its inhabitant. The walls that were meant to confine also cultivated despair through their very fabric, their sights, their sounds, and their pervasive, inescapable wretchedness. The very air one breathed seemed heavy with the accumulated misery of generations. The living spaces themselves were typically monuments to misery. These were often not purpose-built structures designed with any thought to comfort or therapy, but rather adapted sections of older buildings, perhaps disused monastic wings, crumbling town fortifications, or even subterranean dungeons. Stone was the predominant material. Cold, unyielding stone for walls, flagged or bare earth for floors. Any sense of warmth or welcome was entirely absent. These were places built to endure and to ensure those within endured their confinement, however unpleasantly. The architecture itself seemed to frown upon its occupants, a constant, silent judgment. For those individuals deemed particularly disruptive, violent, or in need of strict separation, small, solitary cells were the norm. Imagine a room scarcely larger than a generous cupboard, often windowless or with only a small, high slit in the wall that admitted little light and less air. Dampness would be a constant companion, the stone walls weeping moisture, the air thick and stagnant, carrying the chill of the earth. In such confined darkness, the mind, already troubled, would have little stimulus beyond its own spiraling thoughts, the rhythmic drip of water or the distant, muffled cries of others, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence of solitude. Communal wards, if they existed, offered a different kind of torment. Here, a larger number of inmates would be housed together, sometimes dozens in a single cavernous room. Overcrowding was endemic, meaning individuals lived cheek by jowl, with absolutely no personal space, day or night. The floor would be their primary domain, a shared landscape of suffering where one person's restless night or sudden outburst became everyone's disturbance. The constant presence of others, each with their own agitations, delusions, or profound miseries, meant there was no escape, no moment of private peace or reflection. Light, that fundamental comfort, was a scarce commodity. The small, often barred windows were designed more for security than illumination and were frequently grimy or obstructed, allowing only a pale, weak light to penetrate the gloom. Artificial light, such as tallow candles, smoky rushlights, or oil lamps, would have been used sparingly due to cost and the ever-present risk of fire in buildings often filled with straw. Consequently, a pervasive gloom would have characterized much of the day, with long hours spent in near-total darkness, especially during the winter months. This perpetual twilight could only deepen the sense of isolation and melancholy, blurring the passage of time into an undifferentiated gray. Temperature control was virtually non-existent within the areas designated for inmates. In winter, the stone structures would become bitterly cold, the dampness penetrating every corner and chilling inhabitants to the bone, making joints ache and breath visible. Fireplaces or braziers, if present at all in the institution, were unlikely to be found in the common cells or wards, those being luxuries reserved for staff or more privileged sections. In summer, these same poorly ventilated spaces could become stiflingly hot and fetid, the air thick with the combined heat of bodies and the stench of poor sanitation. The inmates were thus at the mercy of the seasons, with no respite from nature's extremes. When it came to furnishings, the term itself feels like an overstatement. The concept of providing comfort was alien. Bedding, if supplied, typically consisted of loose straw, perhaps piled in a corner or spread thinly over the cold stone or rough wooden floor. This straw was rarely changed, quickly becoming compacted, soiled with human waste, food remnants, and infested with lice, fleas, and other vermin. It offered minimal cushioning and was in itself a source of discomfort and disease. Some inmates might have had nothing but the bare floor, their bodies aching from constant contact with the unyielding surface. Blankets or other coverings were equally meager. A single, rough woolen blanket, often tattered and filthy, stiff with grime, might be the only protection against the night's chill. In many cases, individuals were left with only the rags they wore, assuming they had any. The idea of a proper bed, with a mattress and clean linens, was an unimaginable luxury within these walls. The constant physical discomfort contributed significantly to the overall suffering, making rest and sleep elusive, a longed-for escape that seldom came peacefully. Other forms of furniture were practically unheard of. There would be no tables for eating, no chairs for sitting, no chests for personal belongings, which were in any case usually confiscated. Life was lived at floor level, a primal existence. The only common furnishing in a cell or ward might be a single wooden bucket or an open pit in a corner designated for human waste, a stark testament to the primitive conditions and the utter lack of dignity afforded to the inhabitants. This object would be a focal point of stench and disgust. Hygiene, as we understand it, was completely absent. Regular bathing was not a feature of medieval institutional life, not even a distant consideration for its charges. Water was a precious resource, usually prioritized for drinking, if clean, or cooking, not for the cleanliness of inmates. Soap was a luxury far beyond the reach of such establishments. As a result, bodies went unwashed for weeks, months, or even years, leading to encrusted filth, rampant infestations of lice and fleas whose bites were a constant torment, and a host of painful and debilitating skin conditions like scabies or ulcers. Sanitation facilities were horrifyingly crude. In communal areas, a designated corner might serve as a latrine, its contents rarely cleared, overflowing onto the floor. Chamber pots or buckets, if provided in cells, would be infrequently empty, their overflowing contents adding to the general squalor and stench, attracting swarms of flies. Sometimes, a simple trench in an outside yard was the only provision. The pervasive smell of human excrement, urine, and unwashed bodies would have been an inescapable and defining characteristic of the institution, a constant assault on the olfactory senses that one could never become accustomed to. The cleaning of these living spaces was, predictably, minimal to non-existent. The floors, whether stone or earth, would be caked with accumulated grime, spilled food, and bodily fluids. Walls would be similarly soiled, perhaps bearing the marks of countless desperate hands or smeared with filth. The straw bedding, as mentioned, became a festering breeding ground for vermin and pathogens. This profound lack of cleanliness was not merely unpleasant, it was a direct contributor to the rampant spread of disease within the institution's walls, making recovery from any ailment nearly impossible. Any attempt at cleaning might simply involve a cursory sweep, stirring the filth into the air. Food provided was primarily about basic, minimal sustenance rather than nourishment or comfort. The typical diet would consist of cheap, monotonous fare, a thin gruel or pottage made from oats or barley, often watery and tasteless, perhaps some coarse, stale bread, sometimes moldy, and weak, often sour, beer or ale, which was safer than water in many instances. Fresh fruit, vegetables, or meat of any decent quality would be exceedingly rare, reserved perhaps for the keepers or the paying wealthier inmates, if any. This was a diet to barely sustain life, not to promote health, or strength. The quantity of food was often as problematic as its quality. Portions were frequently insufficient to maintain health, leading to chronic malnutrition, weakness, and a heightened susceptibility to illness. Food could also be used as a tool of control by the keepers, withheld as punishment or doled out sparingly to ensure docility. Inmates were often in a state of perpetual hunger, their bodies and spirits eroded by the constant deprivation, their thoughts perhaps consumed by the next meager offering. The method of serving food reflected the general lack of dignity. It might be slopped into communal troughs, from which inmates ate directly, like animals, or into rough wooden bowls, if these were even provided. Utensils were a rarity. Most would eat with their hands, grabbing what they could. In overcrowded wards, the distribution of food could be a chaotic affair, with the stronger or more aggressive inmates potentially taking more than their share, leaving the weaker or more passive to go without, fostering resentment and conflict. Access to clean drinking water was another critical issue. Water sources, such as wells within the institution's grounds, could easily become contaminated due to poor sanitation, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other waterborne diseases. Often, the water provided was brackish, unpalatable, or simply insufficient, adding thirst to the inmates' litany of discomforts. Dehydration would further weaken their already compromised state. The cumulative sensory experience of living in such an environment was an unceasing torment. The noise level was often overwhelming. The screams and shouts of agitated or distressed individuals, the mournful weeping of the melancholic, the incoherent babbling of others, the harsh orders and curses of the keepers, and the constant, unnerving clanking of chains as inmates moved or strained against their bonds. There was no peace, no quiet refuge, day or night. This auditory hell could shatter already fragile nerves and make coherent thought impossible. The smells, as detailed, were an ever-present miasma of human waste, unwashed bodies, sickness, damp decay, and stale rotting food. This olfactory environment was not just offensive. It was a constant reminder of the degradation and filth that defined their existence. It clung to their clothes, their skin, their hair, becoming an inescapable part of their identity as inmates. It was the perfume of despair. In terms of physical comfort, there was none. The touch of cold, damp stone or rough, vermin-infested straw was the norm. The constant irritation of flea and louse bites, the chafe of restraints against skin, often leading to open sores and infections, the gnawing ache of hunger, and the pain of untreated ailments were daily realities. Gentle human touch, a comforting hand, or a word of solace were almost entirely absent from their interactions. The only touch might be the rough grasp of a keeper. The weight and coldness of iron restraints were a constant reminder of their captivity. Chains on ankles made every step a laborious effort, while manacles on wrists restricted even the simplest of actions. These were not removed for sleep, nor often for bodily functions. Over time, muscles would atrophy from disuse, and skin would break down under the pressure and friction, leading to festering wounds that received no care. The restraints were a physical manifestation of their social and mental bondage. Vermin were not just a nuisance, they were constant companions. The lice crawling through hair and clothing, fleas feasting on blood, and rats scurrying in the darkness, perhaps even nibbling at incapacitated inmates, were part of the horrifying ecosystem of the asylum. The psychological toll of this constant infestation, the feeling of being perpetually unclean and preyed upon, added another layer of torment to an already unbearable existence. The lack of privacy was absolute and profoundly dehumanizing. In communal cells, or even when restrained in more open areas, inmates were under constant observation, either by keepers or by their fellow sufferers. There was no personal space, no moment of solitude to collect one's thoughts or grieve in private. Even the most basic human functions, such as relieving oneself, often had to be performed in the open or in close proximity to others, stripping away any remaining shreds of dignity and fostering a deep sense of shame. Clothing for the inmates was rudimentary. Many were left in the tattered, filthy rags they had arrived in until they disintegrated. Others might be given a single, coarse, institutional garment, a simple shift or tunic, which was rarely washed and offered little protection against the biting cold or the abrasive environment. Sometimes, inmates were kept entirely naked or near naked, especially if deemed destructive of their clothes or prone to smearing excrement, further exposing them to the elements, to indignity, and to the leering gaze of any onlookers. Disease and mortality were constant shadows. Given these appalling conditions, the overcrowding, the profound lack of sanitation, the chronic malnutrition, and the absence of any meaningful medical care, it is no surprise that these institutions were breeding grounds for diseases like typhus, often called gall fever, dysentery, influenza, smallpox, and tuberculosis. Outbreaks would have swept through the inmate population with devastating effect. The already weakened bodies, their immune systems compromised, had little resistance. Consequently, mortality rates within medieval asylums were likely exceptionally high, though detailed records are often scarce or non-existent for the earliest periods. For many, death from disease, starvation, neglect, or even violence at the hands of other inmates or keepers was the only escape from their unrelenting misery. The asylum was often a place where people were sent to die, slowly or quickly, rather than to be healed. The quiet removal of a body was likely a common, uncommented event. Some institutions might have possessed an enclosed yard, ostensibly for exercise or fresh air. However, these yards were often just as squalid and overcrowded as the indoor spaces. They might be muddy, unkempt areas, strewn with refuse, still echoing with the sounds of suffering, offering little true respite from the grim interior. Any exercise would be unsupervised, and the yard could simply become another arena for the display of distress, for bullying, or for the exertion of brutality by keepers. It was rarely a place of rejuvenation. The daily routine, if such a structured term can be applied, was largely one of enforced idleness and neglect. There was no occupational therapy, no activities to engage the mind or body in a positive way. Time stretched endlessly, marked only by the meager delivery of food, the changing of the light if visible, or the occasional, often harsh, intervention of a keeper. This crushing monotony and lack of purpose could deepen depression, increase agitation, and lead to a further unraveling of the mind. The interactions with keepers were minimal and almost exclusively functional or punitive. Food might be thrust at them, restraints checked or tightened, orders barked. There was little or no conversation, certainly no attempt at understanding or empathy. The keepers were there to control, not to care. Their own lives likely brutal, and their sensibilities hardened by the daily exposure to such profound human suffering and perceived danger. Interactions between inmates themselves were complex and often fraught. In the absence of any constructive outlets, some might withdraw completely, while others might become more aggressive. Fleeting moments of shared humanity or mutual support were possible, but likely rare in an environment that pitted individuals against each other for scarce resources and fostered an atmosphere of fear and unpredictability. Mostly, it was a landscape of isolated suffering, even amidst a crowd. The external weather profoundly influenced the internal environment. Heavy rains would seep through leaking roofs and porous walls, exacerbating the dampness and chill, turning straw bedding into sodden, reeking messes. Icy winds would whistle through cracks in the walls and ill-fitting window shutters, making the cold unbearable. Summer heat waves would intensify the stench of filth and decay, making the airless cells and wards feel like ovens. The building offered poor defense against the elements, leaving inmates exposed and miserable. Specific vulnerabilities were amplified by these conditions. The elderly or physically frail would succumb more quickly to disease and the harsh environment. Those with paranoid delusions might find their fears confirmed by the constant surveillance, the unexplained noises, and the threatening atmosphere. Individuals prone to agitation could be driven to greater heights of frenzy by the lack of peace and the constant provocations, leading to harsher restraints and punishments. The very concept of cleanliness could be inverted. If any attempt was made to clean an inmate, it might involve a brutal dousing with buckets of cold water, regardless of the weather, or a rough scrubbing that abraded the skin. Cleaning a cell might mean a cursory sweep that merely displaced the filth or stirred up clouds of dust and disturbed vermin, offering no real improvement and potentially adding to the distress. The ever-present risk of fire in buildings reliant on straw and rudimentary lighting would have been a terrifying, if often unspoken, threat. A dropped torch or an overturned candle could quickly ignite the dry straw and aged wooden structures, leading to an inferno from which escape, especially for those in restraints or locked cells, would be impossible. The thought must have lurked in the minds of those capable of such foresight. This relentless assault of negative sensory input, deprivation, and discomfort actively worked to erode any sense of self-worth or individuality. The environment continuously signaled to the inmate that they were subhuman, undeserving of basic comfort or dignity. It was a powerful daily reinforcement of their outcast status, grinding down their spirit until, for many, only a shell of their former self remained. While the general picture is one of uniform dreadfulness, it is possible that slight variations existed. An institution with slightly better funding, perhaps due to a wealthy patron or income from more affluent paying inmates, a practice that became more common later, might have offered marginally better food or slightly less horrific conditions in certain sections. However, the baseline standard of care for the majority, particularly the pauper lunatics, remained abysmally low across the board throughout the medieval period. These were exceptions that highlighted the rule of misery. The profound psychological impact of this relentlessly hostile physical environment cannot be overstated. Constant exposure to cold, hunger, filth, noise, and the sight of others' extreme suffering, coupled with the total lack of comfort, privacy, or kindness, would inevitably deepen existing mental anguish. For individuals whose grip on reality was already tenuous, this environment could shatter it completely. It was an existence that actively worked against any possibility of recovery, fostering despair, regression, and a final surrender to the surrounding madness. The very stones seemed to cry out with past and present anguish, absorbing the sorrow until the building itself felt saturated with it. Once an individual crossed the threshold into a medieval institution for the mad, they entered a realm where the concept of care diverged alarmingly from any modern understanding. The interventions and routines they faced were rarely designed for healing or comfort. Instead, they were rooted in a mixture of fear, flawed medical theories, a desperate need for social control, and often outright brutality. This chapter delves into the harsh realities of these so-called treatments and the pervasive use of restraints, painting a stark picture of life under medieval institutional care. The primary goal was not recovery, but submission, often achieved through methods that aimed to break the will of the afflicted. Physical restraints were the cornerstone of management within these early asylums. They were the first resort, not the last, for any individual perceived as agitated, violent, or merely inconvenient. Chains were ubiquitous. Heavy iron links would be fastened around ankles and wrists, their cold weight a constant presence. These chains might be short, severely limiting movement, or long enough to allow a few paces within a cell, often tethering the inmate to a ring, bolted into a stone wall or heavy block on the floor. The clanking of these chains was the pervasive soundtrack of the institution, a grim music accompanying every moment. Manacles, designed specifically for the wrists and ankles, were another common tool. These iron cuffs could be tightened to an excruciating degree, biting into flesh, causing sores, abrasions, and eventually, infections if the skin broke. Prolonged immobilization by such means would lead to muscle atrophy, joint stiffness, and an increased risk of blood clots, a silent killer. The simple act of attending to basic bodily needs became an agonizing struggle if permitted at all without assistance, which was rarely forthcoming. The restraints were a physical embodiment of the inmate's loss of autonomy and a constant source of gnawing pain. Beyond simple chaining, institutions might employ stocks or pillories, instruments more commonly associated with public punishment. Within the asylum's walls, an individual could be confined in these for extended periods, their limbs locked in uncomfortable, fixed positions, exposed to the elements if in a yard, or to the scorn of others if in a communal area. This not only caused physical pain and numbness, but also subjected them to profound humiliation. It was a method designed to break the will as much as to restrict movement, reinforcing their status as transgressors against an unseen social order. In some cases, particularly for those deemed exceptionally wild or destructive, crude cages or crib-like enclosures were used. Imagine a heavy wooden or iron-barred box, sometimes barely large enough for a person to lie down or crouch in, their limbs scraping against the rough confines. Here, an individual might be confined for days, weeks, or even longer, treated more like a dangerous animal than a suffering human being. Food and water would be passed through the bars, and waste would accumulate within the cramped space, creating conditions of unimaginable squalor and despair. The world viewed through these bars would be a terrifyingly restricted one. While sophisticated strait-waist coats were a later development, the principle of binding the upper body was understood. Ropes, leather straps, or strong cloth might be used to immobilize the arms, preventing an inmate from harming themselves, others, or property. However, such binding, especially if applied tightly for long periods by untrained hands, could restrict breathing, interfere with circulation, and cause severe chafing or nerve damage. The aim was total subjugation of the body, rendering the individual helpless and at the mercy of their keepers. The rationale behind this pervasive use of restraint was overwhelmingly one of control. Keepers, often outnumbered and fearful of the inmates whose conditions they did not understand, relied on these physical means to maintain order and ensure their own safety. There was little to no consideration for the psychological impact on the inmate, nor any understanding that such brutal measures could exacerbate agitation and fear, creating a vicious cycle. Restraint was discipline, not therapy. It was about managing the unmanageable through force. Isolation was another frequently employed measure, often presented as a way to calm a heated brain or protect others from disrupted behavior. Individuals might be locked away in solitary cells, sometimes for extended periods that stretched into weeks or months. These cells were often dark, damp, and cold, offering no sensory comfort, no human contact. For someone already struggling with internal turmoil, Such profound sensory deprivation or the amplification of their own thoughts in the oppressive silence could be a terrifying experience, leading to further withdrawal or a deepening of delusional states. It was a punishment disguised as a procedure, a slow erosion of the social self. Deprivation in various forms also featured in the arsenal of treatments. Starvation or severely restricted diets were sometimes prescribed, particularly for agitated or manic individuals. This was based on the humoral theory that an excess of hot humors might be fueling the madness, and that reducing food intake could cool the system. The actual effect, however, was to weaken the individual physically and mentally, making them more docile through sheer exhaustion and malnutrition, but certainly not curing their underlying condition. Hunger became a tool of pacification. The denial of basic warmth and comfort, while often a result of general neglect, could also be rationalized as a form of treatment. Exposure to cold was sometimes thought to dampen fiery passions or calm an overactive mind. Inmates might be deliberately left with insufficient bedding or clothing in unheated cells, their suffering intensified by the biting chill which seeped into their very bones. Such practices, of course, led to physical illness like pneumonia or severe chilblains, and further misery, not mental improvement. When medical interventions were attempted, they were invariably based on the ancient and deeply flawed humoral theory. Bleeding or phlebotomy was a mainstay of medical practice for almost every ailment, and madness was no exception. It was believed that by opening a vein with a lancet, or by applying leeches to the skin, often to the temples for head afflictions, bad or excessive humors could be drained from the body, restoring balance. Or mental agitation, it was thought to reduce the volume of overheated blood rushing to the brain. The reality of bleeding was that it often induced profound weakness, dizziness, fainting, and chronic anemia. Repeated bleedings could be life-threatening, especially for individuals already weakened by poor diet and harsh conditions. The procedure itself, performed with unsterilized instruments, carried a high risk of infection and sepsis. Yet it was applied with conviction, the quantity of blood drawn sometimes being alarmingly large, based on the perceived severity of the madness or the perceived robustness of the patient, often to their detriment. Purging and the administration of emetics were equally common and brutal. Strong laxatives concocted from harsh herbs like hellebore, notorious for its toxicity and ability to induce violent gastrointestinal reactions, senna or scammony, were given to violently cleanse the bowels, supposedly expelling corrupt humors such as black bile, which was associated with melancholy. Similarly, substances that induced vomiting were used to rid the body of choler or other peccant matter. These procedures led to violent cramping, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and extreme exhaustion, leaving the patient prostrate but no closer to mental well-being. Cupping was another humoral practice. Heated glass cups would be placed on the skin, creating a vacuum that drew the skin upwards, sometimes causing large, painful welts. This was dry cupping. Wet cupping involved making small incisions in the skin with a scarificator before applying the cups, so that blood would be drawn out into the cup. Like bleeding, this was intended to remove harmful humors locally, but its benefits were illusory, while the discomfort, bruising, and risk of infection were very real. While less common as a direct asylum treatment for general madness, the ancient practice of trepanation, boring a hole into the skull, was known in medieval medical traditions for certain head ailments such as epilepsy or skull fractures, with the idea of releasing pressure or evil spirits. Its extreme nature, the excruciating pain involved without effective anesthesia, and high risk of death or permanent brain damage meant it wasn't a routine procedure in asylums, but its existence underscores the often desperate and invasive measures considered in the face of baffling afflictions of the head and mind. Hydrotherapy in its medieval incarnation was primarily about shock and ordeal. Cold baths were a favored treatment. This could involve forcibly immersing an individual, often bound, into a tub or vat of icy water, or repeatedly dousing them with buckets of it. The shock to the system was believed to jolt the patient out of their madness, cool an inflamed brain, or drive out possessing demons. The experience was terrifying and physically debilitating, risking hypothermia, cardiac arrest, and extreme stress. Sometimes, the element of surprise was considered key. The bath of surprise involved dropping an unsuspecting patient through a trap door into a pool of cold water. The theory was that the sudden shock would be more potent in rearranging their disordered thoughts. More prolonged applications included the douche, where a continuous stream of cold water was directed, often with considerable force, onto the patient's head or body for extended periods, a form of watery torment that left them gasping and shivering uncontrollably. Given the pervasive belief in demonic possession as a cause of madness, some treatments were explicitly aimed at expelling these malevolent entities. While formal exorcism rites were usually the purview of the clergy, the principles could extend to the asylum. Keepers or visiting clergy might recite prayers, sprinkle holy water, or apply sacred relics to the afflicted, sometimes with genuine piety, other times as a perfunctory ritual. However, the line often blurred into physical abuse. Beatings, whippings, or other forms of physical punishment were sometimes rationalized as attempts to make the body an inhospitable vessel for the possessing demon or to literally beat the madness out of a person. The idea was that extreme pain might drive the evil spirit away or break the patient's supposedly stubborn refusal to behave. This, of course, was indistinguishable from simple, brutal punishment inflicted under the thinnest veneer of therapeutic or spiritual intent. Other physical interventions might be employed with similarly flawed reasoning. Sudden loud noises, such as the clanging of pans or the firing of a gun near the patient, were sometimes used to startle or awaken those lost in stupor or melancholy. Conversely, specific types of music were occasionally tried, with some ancient authorities believing certain melodies could soothe agitated spirits, though this was a far gentler approach and likely less common than the harsher methods in the grim reality of an under-resourced institution. Dietary treatments also went beyond mere restriction. Based on humoral theory, specific foods were prescribed or forbidden to correct perceived imbalances. For example, cold and moist foods like cucumbers or melons might be given for conditions attributed to excessive choler, hot and dry, while hot and dry foods like roasted meats or spiced wine might be used for phlegmatic, cold and moist individuals. These dietary regimens were often complex, nutritionally unsound, and ultimately ineffective against serious mental illness, sometimes even harmful. Throughout all these practices, the consistent thread is the profound lack of genuine therapeutic intent as we understand it. The focus was overwhelmingly on controlling behavior, subduing the patient, and adhering to deeply entrenched, erroneous medical doctrines. An underlying philosophy was often that of breaking the will. Madness was perceived by some not as an illness, but as a form of moral failing or stubbornness that needed to be forcibly corrected. The suffering inflicted by these treatments was immense, often far outweighing any supposed benefit, and frequently worsening the patient's physical and mental state. These interventions were not typically isolated events. For an inmate who did not show improvement, meaning did not become more docile or cease their disruptive behaviors, these harsh treatments could be repeated relentlessly. Bleeding might occur every few days, purges administered weekly, or cold dousings become a daily ritual. The cumulative effect of such repeated assaults on an already weakened system was devastating, leading to a state of chronic ilhamet, terror, and profound despair. Imagine the acute dread an inmate would feel hearing the approach of the keepers, knowing it was time for another treatment. The sounds of chains being unfastened, not for relief, but for repositioning, for an ordeal, the sight of the lancet or the tub of cold water. This anticipation itself became a form of psychological torture, amplifying the trauma of the procedure itself. This constant state of fear would wear down even the most resilient spirit. Success, in the eyes of the keepers or the rudimentary physicians of the time, was often measured by the cessation of troublesome behavior. A patient who became silent, withdrawn, and utterly compliant after weeks of treatment might be deemed cured, or at least managed. This cure was often nothing more than the result of physical exhaustion, profound psychological trauma, or the learned helplessness that comes from enduring inescapable torment. The internal state of the patient, their actual mental well-being, was rarely a consideration. Sometimes, these treatments might be carried out in view of other inmates. A particularly violent purging, a public dousing, or the application of restraints to a struggling individual could serve as a powerful, unspoken warning to others. It was a stark demonstration of the keeper's power and the consequences of non-compliance, helping to maintain a climate of fear and control throughout the institution. The suffering of one became a tool to manage the many. Any form of resistance to these procedures was met with overwhelming force. An inmate who struggled against being bled or who refused a noxious potion would likely be subjected to even tighter restraints, more keepers to overpower them, and perhaps additional punitive measures later. The notion of a patient having the right to refuse treatment was entirely alien. Their bodies and wills were considered subject to the authority of the institution and its flawed medical doctrine. Following a particularly harsh intervention, such as a significant bloodletting or a violent purge, there was little concept of aftercare or medical monitoring. The weakened, often traumatized patient would likely be returned to their cold, filthy cell, left to recover or deteriorate on their own. Complications like infection from unsterilized instruments, severe dehydration, or shock were common but often went unrecognized or untreated, further contributing to the high mortality rates. The individuals administering these treatments, the keepers and occasional visiting physicians, operated with a certainty born of unquestioned tradition and deeply flawed knowledge. While it's anachronistic to apply the full mad doctor archetype, the image of practitioners causing immense suffering, in the sincere if misguided belief they were providing necessary medical intervention, is a disturbing one. Their actions, however horrific in retrospect, were often sanctioned by the prevailing medical and societal norms. The economic realities of the institution also played a role. Simpler, cheaper interventions were likely more common. Chains were a long-term investment. Dousing with readily available water was inexpensive. Herbal concoctions for purges could be gathered or cheaply bought. More complex or costly treatments, if any existed, would be reserved for those few whose families could afford to pay substantially for their care, though even then, the underlying brutality often remained. The individuals administering these treatments were not trained medical professionals in the modern sense. Keepers were often uneducated, ill-paid, and chosen for their brawn rather than their compassion or skill. Their understanding of mental illness was shaped by the same fears and superstitions prevalent in the wider society. They applied these brutal methods with little finesse, often motivated by a desire to maintain order, to punish perceived transgressions, or simply because it was what they were instructed to do, or what had always been done. Their role was more akin to that of a jailer than a healer. Imagine the sheer terror and confusion of an inmate subjected to these practices. Restrained, starved, bled until faint, plunged into icy water, or beaten, all without understanding why or by individuals who showed no empathy for their suffering. It would feel less like treatment and more like torture. Any pleas for mercy would likely be ignored or interpreted as further evidence of their madness. The experience would ingrain a deep fear of their caregivers and their surroundings, making any potential for trust impossible. The very notion of healing was often absent. If a patient became quiet and withdrawn after a series of harsh interventions, this might be interpreted as an improvement, a sign that the madness had been subdued. In reality, the individual might simply be traumatized into submission, physically weakened beyond the point of resistance, or have retreated further into an internal world as a defense against the external torment. The cure was often worse than the perceived disease. Even practices that might seem to have a grain of logic, like providing a structured environment, were corrupted. The structure was one of rigid control and punitive discipline, not of supportive routine. There was no attempt to engage the patient's mind, to offer solace, or to build a therapeutic relationship. The human element was almost entirely missing from these medieval care paradigms, replaced by a mechanistic and often violent approach to bodily and mental disorder. The physical toll of these treatments compounded the misery of the living conditions. An individual already weakened by malnutrition and unsanitary surroundings was now further debilitated by blood loss, the shock of cold water, or the violence of purges. Resistance to disease would plummet, and the likelihood of succumbing to common infections would soar. Many treatments inadvertently hastened death, turning the asylum into a charnel house. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Instead of fostering trust and a sense of safety, these interventions induced terror, pain, and a profound sense of helplessness and hopelessness. They reinforced the message that the individual was flawed, deserving of punishment, and beyond true help. Any capacity for recovery would be severely undermined by the trauma of such care. This was not a system designed to restore, but one that often led to complete disintegration of the self. It is a chilling thought that these practices were not generally considered sadistic by those who administered them, but rather as necessary, if unpleasant measures, legitimized by the medical and spiritual beliefs of the time. This highlights the vast chasm between medieval and modern understandings of both medicine and humanity. The road to more enlightened, compassionate care would be a very long and arduous one, built upon the suffering of countless individuals who endured these brutalities. The medieval asylum was in many ways a crucible of misguided interventions, where good intentions, if they existed at all, were paved with horrific practices and devastating consequences. The grim walls of a medieval institution for the mad did not exclusively house individuals suffering from what we might now recognize as acute psychosis or severe mental derangement. While such conditions certainly accounted for a portion of the inmate population, the definition of madness in the medieval period was far broader and more subjective and deeply intertwined with social, economic and moral judgments. Consequently, these early asylums became receptacles for a surprisingly diverse array of human conditions and societal outcasts, many of whom would never be considered for psychiatric committal today. The shadows of these places hid a multitude of unfortunate souls. Certainly, individuals experiencing profound mental illnesses were present, those afflicted by terrifying hallucinations, incomprehensible delusions, bouts of uncontrollable mania, or deep, immobilizing melancholia, symptoms perhaps indicative of conditions like schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, would have been prime candidates for confinement. Their behavior, often frightening and inexplicable to their contemporaries, readily fit the medieval understanding of lunacy or demonic possession. For these individuals, the asylum, with its brutal conditions, offered no solace, only an environment that likely exacerbated their internal torment, their cries for help lost in the general din of misery. Beyond these acute cases, a significant number of inmates were those with intellectual disabilities, whether congenital or acquired. In an era with no understanding of genetics or neurodevelopmental disorders, individuals born with conditions such as Down syndrome or those who suffered brain damage leading to significant cognitive impairment were often labeled as natural fools, idiots, or simpletons. If their families possessed the resources and compassion, they might be cared for at home. However, if they lacked support, became orphaned, or were perceived as too burdensome, the local asylum or poorhouse often became their default and final residence. Their inability to conform to societal expectations of productivity made them vulnerable. The elderly, too, were vulnerable to being swept into these institutions. As individuals aged, the onset of conditions like Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, though not understood as such, would lead to progressive memory loss, confusion, agitation, and an inability to care for oneself. Such behaviors, alarming and difficult for families to manage without support, could easily be interpreted as a descent into madness. If a family was unable or unwilling to provide the intensive care required, or perhaps saw an opportunity to control the elder's assets, consigning their elderly relative to an asylum was a grim but not uncommon solution. Poverty was a powerful current that dragged many towards the asylum's gates. In a society with few safety nets, individuals who fell into destitution, especially if their poverty was compounded by physical illness, old age, or even mild eccentricity, could find themselves labeled as mad vagrants. Authorities, keen to maintain public order and clear the streets of those perceived as unsightly or burdensome, might use the asylum as a convenient dumping ground. For some, their primary affliction was not mental illness, but indigence, and the asylum was the only terrible shelter available to them, a prison for the unfortunate. Epilepsy, with its dramatic and often frightening seizures, continued to be widely misunderstood. The convulsions, loss of consciousness, and sometimes strange vocalizations or behaviors during or after a seizure were frequently attributed to demonic possession or seen as a clear sign of madness. Sufferers of epilepsy, particularly if their seizures were frequent, violent, or occurred in public, families might struggle to manage their care and communities might fear them, leading to their confinement within asylums where their neurological condition received no appropriate understanding or treatment, only restraint and neglect. Certain physical illnesses could also manifest symptoms that mimicked or were mistaken for primary mental derangement. Conditions such as encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, advanced stages of syphilis, which could cause profound neurological and psychiatric symptoms, though its full understanding evolved later, pellagra from dietary deficiencies, or even prolonged high fevers leading to delirium, could result in behaviors that led to an individual being judged as mad and confined. In the absence of diagnostic tools, the symptoms were all that mattered, and the asylum was the all-too-common response, treating the effect rather than the cause. Women were particularly vulnerable to accusations of madness in a society governed by rigid patriarchal norms. The term hysteria, with its ancient and erroneous linkage to the womb, was a convenient label for a wide range of female behaviors that were deemed unacceptable or problematic. A woman who was too outspoken, defiant of male authority, perceived as overly emotional or melancholic, perhaps suffering from unrecognized postpartum depression or the effects of menopause, or who transgressed sexual norms, could risk being labeled hysterical or mad by husbands, fathers, or community leaders. For husbands or fathers seeking to control unruly female relatives or to rid themselves of an inconvenient wife, an accusation of madness, supported by a compliant physician or clergyman, could be a swift route to her confinement. Consider the widow who resisted male relatives' attempts to control her late husband's property, or the young woman who refused an advantageous but unwanted marriage. Perhaps even a woman with a keen intellect who pursued scholarly interests deemed unfeminine might find her passions described as a dangerous imbalance. Confinement silenced dissent and reinforced patriarchal power structures. While medieval asylums were not the sophisticated instruments of political repression that later totalitarian regimes would employ, the label of madness could occasionally be used to discredit or silence individuals whose beliefs or actions were radically out of step with prevailing social, political, or religious doctrines. Someone who persistently challenged powerful authorities, espoused heretical views, or was simply a troublesome nonconformist might, if they lacked sufficient power or protection, find themselves declared insane and quietly removed to an institution. This was less about systemic policy and more an ad hoc misuse of the asylum for social control, a way to pathologize dissent. The category of the inconvenient relative also contributed to the diverse asylum population. As touched upon in the context of admission, if an individual stood in the way of an inheritance, was a constant source of family embarrassment due to eccentricities not amounting to severe illness, or was simply a dependent burden that others wished to shed, confinement under the guise of madness was a potential solution. The less power, wealth, or social connection an individual had, the more vulnerable they were to being put away by those with ulterior motives, their protests easily dismissed as symptoms of their supposed affliction. Crucially, social status played a profound role in determining who ended up in these public institutions and what kind of care they might receive. Wealthy families often had alternatives. If a member of an affluent family exhibited signs of mental disturbance, they were more likely to be confined discreetly within the family estate, perhaps in a secluded wing or outbuilding, attended by private servants or physicians. This approach avoided the public stigma of the asylum and potentially offered a marginally better standard of living, though not necessarily more enlightened treatment. The family's reputation and assets were thus protected from scandal. For the poor, however, such private arrangements were an impossibility. If family care broke down, or if an individual was destitute and alone, the public asylum, with all its attendant horrors of squalor, neglect, and brutality, was often the only destination. Their poverty made them more visible to parish authorities and constables, and their lack of resources meant they had no means to resist committal or to secure better conditions once inside. The asylum was, in many respects, an institution that disproportionately warehoused the impoverished, a grim reflection of social stratification. The arbitrary nature of what constituted madness further fueled the diverse population. In the absence of any scientific diagnostic criteria, the label was applied based on subjective interpretations of behavior. A local magistrate, a fearful villager, an exasperated family member, or an institutional keeper, each might have a different threshold for what they considered mad. This elasticity meant that individuals with a vast range of conditions, from the profoundly ill to the merely eccentric or unfortunate, could be swept under the same grim institutional umbrella, their individual circumstances ignored. Certain groups were inherently more vulnerable to being labeled and confined. Orphans, who lacked familial protection and advocacy, were at high risk if they displayed any behavioral issues or developmental delays. Widows, especially if they were elderly, poor, or seen as challenging social norms by asserting their independence, could also be targeted. Foreigners or outsiders who might not understand local customs or whose behavior seems strange due to cultural differences could easily be misconstrued as mad and find themselves trapped in a system they didn't comprehend. Even children were not exempt. While perhaps less common than adult inmates, children with severe intellectual disabilities, autism, though entirely unrecognized as such, or extreme behavioral disorders that overwhelmed their families, might find themselves in these institutions. The fate of a child within such an environment surrounded by adult suffering and brutality is particularly heartbreaking to contemplate. Some folk beliefs, like the concept of a changeling, a fairy child swapped for a human baby, might even have made it easier for superstitious families to abandon or seek confinement for a child who was physically different or developmentally delayed, seeing them as not truly their own. The lines between criminality and madness could also become blurred. While asylums were not primarily prisons, an individual who committed a crime while appearing distracted or frenzied might be sent to an asylum rather than a common jail, the idea being their madness negated their culpability, though their confinement could be indefinite. Conversely, some petty criminals, chronic drunkards, or persistent social nuisances whose behavior was deemed incorrigibly disruptive might be labeled as mad simply to justify their long-term removal from society when jail sentences might be too short or ineffective in the eyes of local authorities. Periods of widespread social upheaval, such as famine, plague, or war, could also impact the asylum population. In times of extreme hardship, families might be less able to cope with any dependent members, including those with mental or physical frailties. Authorities, struggling to maintain order amidst a stressed and desperate populace, might be quicker to confine anyone perceived as a potential source of trouble. Furthermore, individuals traumatized by the horrors of war or the loss from pestilence might exhibit behaviors, extreme grief, withdrawal, or agitation that could be misinterpreted as madness, leading them to these institutions. The tragic reality for many inmates, particularly those confined for reasons other than genuine severe mental illness, was the utter hopelessness of their situation. An individual institutionalized because they were poor, inconvenient, or misunderstood had little chance of their true state being recognized within an environment geared towards suppressing madness. Indeed, the appalling conditions and brutal treatments could easily erode the sanity of a healthy person, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where the institution itself manufactured the very behaviors it purported to treat. The early asylum, therefore, functioned as a societal catch-all. It was not merely a hospital for a specific type of illness, but a repository for a wide spectrum of individuals deemed problematic, burdensome, or deviant by the standards of the time. This heterogeneity of the inmate population, the severely psychotic alongside the intellectually disabled, the elderly confused beside the destitute epileptic, the unruly woman beside the simply unfortunate, would have contributed significantly to the chaotic and often terrifying atmosphere within. Managing such a diverse group with their vastly different needs and behaviors would have been an impossible task even for well-intentioned and well-resourced staff, let alone the typically ill-equipped and often brutal keepers of medieval institutions. The result was an environment where the specific needs of individuals were ignored and a baseline of harsh containment was applied to all, regardless of their condition or the reasons for their confinement. Each inmate's story was submerged in a collective narrative of lunacy. The implications of being wrongly confined were dire. Once institutionalized, it was exceedingly difficult to prove one's sanity, especially when any protest or agitation could be interpreted as further evidence of derangement. The individual was trapped, their voice silenced, their identity subsumed by the label of lunatic. Their presence in the asylum served to confirm the initial, often flawed, judgment, creating a closed loop from which escape was nearly impossible. This highlights the immense power imbalance at play. Those with authority, familial, communal, or official, held the power to defy insanity and to impose confinement. Those without power, the poor, the marginalized, women, the intellectually disabled, had little agency to resist this imposition. The asylum became a stark reflection of societal hierarchies and prejudices, a place where the vulnerable were most at risk of disappearing. Understanding this diverse population is crucial to comprehending the true nature of the medieval asylum. It was not simply a place for madmen in a theatrical sense, but a complex, tragic microcosm of society's failures, fears, and its often brutal methods of dealing with those who did not fit neatly within its prescribed boundaries. Each inmate carried a unique story of sorrow, injustice, or profound illness, though most of these narratives were silenced by the very walls that held them captive, lost to the uncaring passage of time. We have journeyed together through some of the darkest corridors of the past, exploring the grim reality of what it meant to be deemed mad in the medieval era, and the harrowing prospect of confinement within its nascent asylums. The very thought of spending even a single day in such a place is, as our title suggests, almost unendurable to the modern mind, and for good reason. Let us briefly reflect on why this was so, and what lessons we might carry from this bleak chapter as we prepare for rest. The medieval understanding of mental affliction, as we've seen, was a tapestry woven from threads of religious dogma, pervasive superstition, and the ancient, flawed theories of humoral imbalance. There was little room for compassion born of scientific insight, replaced instead by fear of the unknown, the inexplicable, and the potentially demonic. This mindset alone created an almost insurmountable barrier to humane care, shaping every societal response to those whose minds seemed to stray. The places of confinement themselves, whether rudimentary hospital annexes, repurposed monastic cells, or institutions like Bethlem in its early, grim evolution, were not sanctuaries. They were often stark stone structures, echoing with the sounds of misery. Cold, damp, and poorly lit, they offered no physical comfort. Only an environment that mirrored the desolation of many an inmate's internal world. The very air was thick with the stench of neglect and despair. And imagine arriving, confused and terrified, forcibly removed from all that was familiar. The admission process itself was an ordeal, a cursory judgment, a stripping away of identity and belongings, and often the immediate application of chains or other crude restraints. There was no gentle welcome, no explanation, no solace, only the stark, cold reality of imprisonment. This initial shock would be a profound assault on anyone's psyche. Then came the daily existence within those walls. The constant, inescapable noise, the cries, the moans, the rattling of chains, the pervasive filth and lack of basic sanitation, breeding vermin and disease, the meager, often spoiled food that barely sustained life, let alone health, the chilling dampness that seeped into bones, and the rough straw, if any, that served as a bed. These conditions alone would make an hour feel like an eternity. And what of the treatments? Far from offering relief, they were instruments of torment. Bleeding, purging, dousing in icy water, prolonged restraint in painful positions, all administered without true understanding, often with the intent to subdue rather than to heal. The fear of these interventions, the pain they inflicted, and the utter lack of control over one's own body would add an unbearable layer of suffering to an already nightmarish existence. So why wouldn't one last a day? It is the confluence of all these factors, the overwhelming fear and confusion, the immediate physical assault of the environment, the brutal so-called treatments, the complete absence of human kindness or understanding, and the swift, total loss of agency. It was an environment designed to break the spirit, not to mend the mind. Hope would be extinguished almost upon arrival. The diverse population within these walls further highlights the tragedy. Beyond those with severe mental illnesses, these institutions housed the intellectually disabled, the elderly with dementia, the desperately poor, epileptics, and women deemed unruly or hysterical by a patriarchal society. Their primary crime was often their vulnerability or their inability to conform. For them, the asylum was not a place of care, but a dumping ground, a solution for societal inconvenience. It is tempting to look back with pure condemnation, to judge these practices solely through the lens of modern morality and scientific understanding, and indeed the suffering inflicted was undeniably horrific. Yet to truly understand, we must also acknowledge the profound historical context. This era was characterized by a pervasive fear of the unknown and a level of ignorance about the human mind and body that is difficult for us to fully grasp. The brutality often stemmed not from a calculated sadistic malice as we might define it, but from a deep-seated societal terror, from medical theories that, while utterly wrong, were widely accepted, and from religious beliefs that attributed inexplicable behavior to supernatural malevolence. Control and containment were prioritized because understanding and effective treatment were simply beyond their ken. This does not excuse the suffering, but it frames it within the limitations of the age. The path from these medieval horrors to the more, though still imperfect, humane and scientific approaches to mental health care we have today has been incredibly long, arduous, and marked by slow incremental changes with many setbacks along the way. Centuries would pass before the chains began to be struck off, before asylums started to transform from prisons into hospitals, and before the voices of the afflicted themselves began to be heard, however faintly. Remembering this difficult past is not an exercise in dwelling on darkness for its own sake. It serves to remind us of the human cost of ignorance and fear. It allows us to appreciate the progress that has been made, however slow, and to recognize the importance of continued compassion, research, and advocacy for those who struggle with mental illness today. The shadows of Bedlam and its counterparts stretch far, subtly influencing societal attitudes even now. As we draw this exploration to a close, let the weight of this history settle, not as a burden to keep you from sleep, but perhaps as a quiet reminder of the complexities of the human experience and the long journey towards understanding. The individuals who endured these conditions are long gone, their specific stories mostly lost to time, but their collective experience is a somber testament. May the knowledge of their suffering deepen our appreciation for the comforts and relative enlightenment of our own time, and may the peace of this present moment, the quiet of your surroundings, and the comfort of your rest be all the more valued. Let these echoes of a distant, troubled past fade gently, allowing your mind to find tranquility.